This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Body Bags with Joseph Scott Morgan. My granny came from a generation that was totally and completely dependent upon those things that they found themselves surrounded by and that were naturally occurring in their isolated rural home. And it didn't matter. That generation and the generations prior to them, they had a way of making do. And one of the things that my grandmother would swear by when it came to any kind of body aches or headaches or things like that was bark off of a willow tree. You know, she said that it had the same properties as an aspirin. And you know what? She's kind of right, because the bark from the willow can knock down pain. It certainly can. And in many cases, that's where the origins of a lot of our compounds that we have today come from. Those things that were discovered, it's not that they have been discovered just in the past 50 years. Some of these things go back years and years. But today I'm going to discuss a drug that I don't even know if I can frame it so that you understand. This drug has its origins all the way back in ancient Egypt. We're going to talk about that drug, and we're going to talk about a physician who is now stands accused of murdering his wife with it. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. Dave, you got a willow tree out in your yard?
No. I was afraid you were going to ask, because I'm sitting here trying to find pictures of willow trees, you know?
So you're not going out and gnawing on the trunk, are you?
No.
Case you get a pounding headache.
Whenever you start going down this path, Joe, I remember the same thing that older relatives would say, you know, that no matter what kind of medicine you could buy in the store, there's a natural thing growing out in the woods that'd be better. I don't disagree with that. It's just I'm not out in the woods that often, and whenever I do eat something like that, they call it poke salad and trick me, you know? It's not a weed. It's not poke salad. That's a weed. It is a weed with bacon grease. That is not any kind of salad.
Well, you know.
That's a seriously Southern thing, isn't it, Joe?
It is very Southern.
Pull up some weeds and you pour bacon grease on it. You can call it whatever you want.
You can call it anything you want, even a parfait. But yeah, and so a lot of our medicines have their origins going back thousands of years. And in today's case, came across my desk, and I was kind of fascinated by this. Because I got to tell you, one of the things that's always terrified me when it comes to, I guess it's part of my own crazy makeup, my own crazy mind. I've always thought, who could potentially make the best assassin? And, you know, people think about powerful special operations guys that are, you know, trained to climb up on buildings and take long distance shots or be handy with an edged weapon. And yeah, those people are absolutely positively terrifying. However, imagine if you had the intellectual ability, professional prowess to administer a drug to someone that had no idea whatsoever what you were about. They could kill you and potentially get away with it. And there would be very little evidence that you were ever even there. And suddenly your life is at an end. And I think today's case, for me, it smacks of this.
You know, it's interesting because a lot of times we have a story like we do today where we know what happened. But if somebody actually did that and got away with it, we wouldn't know it, because the whole point of them doing the killing was something that was untraceable, was so they wouldn't be caught. And
yeah,
of course,
so everybody relax. This person is not currently on the street. So,
no, thankfully not. But, you know, you look at people that are in their 30s, and that's what we have here. We've got a young couple. They're married. In particular, Betty Bowman. Just to give you an idea, Betty Bowman, born and raised in Wichita, Kansas. She is the person that everybody wants to be as a friend. That's how everybody talked about her. She was exceptionally thoughtful. And she also was a go-getter. Graduated from the University of Kansas School of Pharmacy with a pharmaceutical doctorate. Completed her residency. Worked at the Mayo Clinic for a while. She and her husband, Connor Bowman, got married in May of 2021. They lived in Rochester, Minnesota, where Betty worked as a hospital pharmacist, while Connor went through his internal medicine residency. We're dealing with two highly educated people.
Yeah, and let me stop you right there, because over a number of years, I've worked with a lot of pathology residents. I've had people that have passed through Mayo, and it's kind of the gold standard when you think about you've got some kind of incurable disease, or there's something that, look, man, I'm at the end of my rope and I've tied a knot in it. I've got to get somewhere where somebody can offer me some treatment. For a long, long time, Mayo has been that destination. So by virtue of that, you would think that if you want to go for obviously some of the best training that you could possibly get as a physician or as a pharmacist, this would be your target location if you have the academic qualifications to be accepted into this environment. And again, that's another, that's kind of this other thing that you have to jump over. It's like, yeah, I finished medical school, so let me go do a residency at the Mayo Clinic. That's not the way it works. You have to apply, and you're applying with hundreds, maybe thousands of other people that also have the same dream. So the fact that Connor Bowman wound up there, it gives you some insight into his background, because they're not just going to take anybody that graduates from medical school.
One thing to add about Betty Bowman, 32 years old. Betty Bowman found a way to travel. She traveled the world. She wanted to go to Hawaii. She went. Wanted to go to the Caribbean. She went. Hawaii, Iceland, it doesn't matter. She's going everywhere. Grand Canyon, she saw those things. She really was living her best life. Now, Connor, they did have a problem in their marriage, okay? They've been married a few years. The problem was money. And that it was so bad because Connor had such massive debt from college that they kept their money separate. And they were pretty open about it in talking with friends. And when it wasn't spiteful, it was just Betty was smart. Like, dude's been irresponsible. He's got $500,000 in debt. I'm not going to sign on to that. Connor Bowman actually told somebody that there was a $450,000 or $500,000 life insurance policy on his wife, which immediately when your wife dies, that's the first thing they're looking at. Betty Bowman was in good health. She and Connor Bowman were talking about divorce. It was something coming. And they were lightly seeing other people. They were living together as man and wife still, but it was really loose at this point in time. Betty is texting with a friend, a male friend, about she had a couple of days coming up. And she said, we'll hang out together. And they were both excited. That was on the 15th of August. And she's at home with Connor, having a couple of drinks, watching movies. And during the course of the night, she started not feeling well. And the next day, she thought it was like food poisoning. She was that kind of sick, and you're dealing with medical people here. So she goes to the hospital. They take her to the Mayo Clinic St. Mary Hospital on August 16th, and she's admitted with kind of food poisoning diagnosis. And that's what they started treating her for. But she's in good health. She shows up with, again, painful stomach aches and all that. They treat her for gastrointestinal distress and dehydration. After treatment, nothing gets better, and she dies after 4 days. A woman in good health, that doesn't happen.
No, it doesn't. And actually, when you take a look at her, the pictures of her depict her as very vibrant, alive. She doesn't look like she's in poor health. She doesn't look like someone that would just suddenly crash. So everyone understands, they actually live just outside of Rochester, and it was, so much to do up in Minnesota, probably one of the most beautiful states in the United States, with all the lakes and the opportunities that you have to get out and enjoy that environment, canoeing and kayaking. And they were very active, or had been at one point in time. But as you said, they're kind of on the downhill slope. And isn't this fascinating? Yeah. Both these individuals are very young, and they've come through a very stressful period of time in their life. I think that if anything can take years off of your life, it's going to be medical school and any kind of graduate level study, because the world, the environment is so intense. And it's interesting. You have there are any number of cases in my past where I've had friends that were going through medical school and they were married. They got out and did their residency, and almost immediately they got a divorce.
Right.
And it's tragic, but it happens that way. It's almost like they've entered into a new phase of life. But in this case, you've got a husband who's decided for whatever reason that he doesn't want to go on, move forward with his wife. And at the end of the day, he apparently attempts to murder her. There are certain drugs that are out there that are rooted deep in our past, and there's one in particular that comes to mind in this particular case, and it's called colchicine. And let me give you a little background. Colchicine, they being the historians, believe that colchicine was actually written about during, I can't remember which dynasty, but it predates Christ by almost 1,000 years.
Wow.
And it was a naturally occurring substance that was found actually in a flowering plant. And it was used specifically for its anti-inflammatory properties, that if you had, a swollen joint or knee pain and these sorts of things, neck pain, I guess, anything musculoskeletal, it would be applied. Colchicine itself is an oral medication that is actually given to individuals now that suffer from gout. And if you've never been around someone with gout, it's very painful. It comes and goes, and it's a form of arthritis. And I'm preaching the choir. You know how painful it is. Yeah. And colchicine has been one of those things that has been on the roster of drugs that physicians have used for years and years. And in an interesting little twist to this case, as we had mentioned, our young victim in this particular case, she was a pharmacist. Mm-hmm. And the first person to actually go into great depth and detail about the plant that colchicine derives from originally was actually a Greek pharmacist. He was also a physician, but he was a pharmacist and a herbalist. And his name was Dioscorides. And so he made this list of drugs that he could apply to give people relief. And guess who he was giving relief to? He was a camp follower for the Roman army. So he was, wow. He's a Greek guy that was actually studying nature as he went along. And you can imagine all of the aches and the pains that are associated with a legion moving over the countryside and fighting and all those sorts of things. And this drug was actually identified all the way back then. Wow. But it still has utility today. And the thing about it is that apparently Connor Bowman, it would seem at least, he had knowledge of this drug, Dave.
Connor Bowman worked with the University of Kansas, answering calls on their 24-hour poison control hotline on August 5th, 6th, and 10th. He's answering calls regarding poisonings 6 days before his wife shows up at the hospital. The university gave him a laptop to use, for research and what have you. That laptop and other electronic devices all had a VPN authentication process so that only he, Connor Bowman, would be able to use the devices. So when the university found out that the laptop had been seized as part of an investigation, they reached out to investigators to help them locate all of the internet searches conducted by Connor Bowman on their device and network. According to the criminal complaint filed by Detective Kendrick, he was told that Connor Bowman was researching colchicine. They even went further and looked into phone calls that had come into the 24-hour poison control hotline to see if anybody had called in about colchicine. They found out that not only Bowman never received a call about colchicine, but none of the employees answering calls on the 24-hour poison control hotline received any calls about colchicine. So there was no reason for him to actually be looking up that drug
Yes, colchicine.
at that time.
And here's the thing about it. If you understand the pharmacology of this drug, it's easy, and it's readily apparent from Jump Street, where they caution physicians about how lethal this substance is when it is applied in large doses. And guess what, Dave? The symptomology that this poor young woman presented with, and it would have absolutely have been excruciating, falls right in line with what you're seeing with the drug presentation if you've been exposed to colchicine. And so you're talking about this acute abdominal pain. You're talking about where you'll have severe diarrhea. There's vomiting that comes along with it. And if you're a physician and you're having to make this diagnosis, let's just say when she rolls into the hospital at that moment in time, one of the first things you're going to think, well, am I dealing with a case of gastroenteritis? Because that's kind of a common complaint. And then after you rule that out, because you're going to go and say you're going to do blood cultures, you're going to check and see, for instance, what her white count is. If there's any kind of inflammation, and if you're absent the inflammation, but yet she's still presenting with this symptomology, then the physician has to be thinking, well, what in the world could be presenting like this in this woman who's the picture of health? Why is she doubled over in excruciating pain? And as it turns out, she's been dosed with this, as we would later find out.
Let me ask you very quickly about the symptoms. Yeah. Okay, you said these are common symptoms for somebody that maybe has food poisoning. They would have being sick, throwing up, diarrhea, the whole nine. Dehydration comes with it. But they're treating her for all that, and it's not getting better.
Yeah,
actually, she's getting worse. Is that because of the effects of the cult? Not only are they not treating her for what has happened to her in poison, because now Connor Bowman poisoned his wife, but they ended up finding out she had. They did a surgery to remove part of her colon because they said it contained necrotic tissue. What is that?
Well, it means that that part of the bowel, when you hear the term necrotic, it's rooted in necro, okay? Mm-hmm. And necro from the Greek actually translates into death or the dead. That's where we get terms like necrophilia or necrophile, necromancing. All of these terms that lead directly back to death. And so when you have a necrotic loop of bowel, what that means is that for some reason, blood flow to that area of the bowel has been stemmed. Something has prevented it from getting a sufficient blood supply. And guess what happens? That bit of bowel dies. And when it dies, septicemia will set in. And the individual will then develop things like fevers. They can convulse. You'll have all of these other things. So they have no choice but to go in and snip out that bit of bowel and then tie it back together to loop those ends back together so that she'll have a functioning bowel. And it's a horrible position. And when you think about it, I've often used the term of throwing a brick through a stained glass window. You've got this person that is the picture of health that has no prior history whatsoever, nothing like this. And suddenly she's crashing like this. It's a horrible set of circumstances.
Well, that's when I looked at it, and it was the reports and looking at the police reports and everything else, that her condition did take a turn for the worse. She started having heart problems. Fluid buildup in her lungs, and then as mentioned, removal of part of the colon. At this point, though, the doctors are standing around looking at her. They're testing for everything, but they're not having a whole lot of time and no luck. We're talking about 4 days, Joe, from the time she shows up. Actually, 5 days after she's texting back and forth with a friend and having drinks on the couch with her husband. 5 days later, she's dead.
Yeah.
To go that quick at 32 and in good health doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't. And, eventually an individual that is being administered or has been administered a large dosage of this drug would eventually slip into a coma. And so once you try to pull them back from the edge relative to this, you're going downhill very, very quickly, and there's no putting the brakes on, particularly in this case. And that's what they found out as they moved on through. But the big reveal in this case came. It did come with her clinical course and her clinical diagnosis, but the big reveal came when it was time to make a decision about what to do with this young woman's body. Connor has put forth this idea, and remember, he's a physician. He has apparently planted a seed within the brain of the attendings, and probably anybody that would have anything to do with his wife's treatment course. He has told people at the hospital, and actually in an obituary that he put forth, a specific diagnosis for his wife. It's hemophagocytic lymphocytosis, otherwise known as HLH, and it is a condition that is most commonly associated with children and teens. It's not something that you would see, for instance, in an older population. If you did, it would be unusual, to say the very least, and it impacts the white blood cells relative to how they are produced, how they function, and you're going to have presentations of this if you have this condition, HLH, you're going to experience probably acute pain in like the spleen and the liver. It's going to cause the liver to enlarge. And what are we talking about here, Dave, with how she's presenting? Well, she's presenting with this, acute pain, abdominal pain. It's nonspecific, but this is a very specific diagnosis. And as it turns out, she's never suffered from this condition. But yet this is something he's kind of pulled out of the air and pushed forward as the narrative. How bold is that? And that's one of the things I'm saying, when I mentioned earlier that, if I were to try to come up with an ideal assassin, someone that could potentially get away with a homicide, which no one has gotten away with anything at this point. We don't have a conviction here, and a trial hasn't taken place.
Right.
But just from a clinical perspective, hypothetical here, when you're thinking about how much control a physician, and one that's not in the midst of the actual treatment, one that is merely there whispering into the ears of those that are doing the treating, how easy would it be for someone to get away with something like this?
Well, dealing with all these medical people, and you're one of them. It's not like it's an outsider. This is somebody that is also in the doctor family.
Oh,
and he actually is suggesting she has HLH. Nobody's questioning him on it. He's just, he says it very matter-of-factly. But by the way, they did test for that, and she did not test positive. It came out inconclusive for HLH. But there was something else that went on in this. Again, you've got a very fast-moving illness that, from death happens in 4 days on a healthy woman. They treated her for everything that they could think of. It just got worse. And now she's dead. Well, the day after, when they're getting ready to do the autopsy, and Connor Bowman says, no, my wife does not want to have an autopsy. She doesn't want to be
a cadaver. I got to address this. Okay. Listen, you got two choices as to what you want to call yourself after you're dead. Not that you're going to have any control over it. You're either going to be a corpse or a cadaver. And the fact that he would actually say, I don't want my wife to be a cadaver. I think that maybe the implication is that he's trying to say, I don't want my wife did not want to be the subject of any further medical studies in her post-mortem state, which is, listen, I've had tons of people protest over the course of my career a decision to do an autopsy. It happens. And look, I understand it, and they'll come at you with all kinds of gruesome things that they'll say about why they don't want it to occur. I've had people that come up with religious reasons. I've had other people just saying you can't do that. And of course, by law, depending upon the jurisdiction you're in, you can. But yet to say that she did not want, and this is a quote, she did not want to be a cadaver is certainly a strange thing for someone to say. It would give me pause if I was the medical legal authority. However, Dave, there's something a bit more, even more sinister than this. He is saying that not only does he not want an autopsy for his wife to be a cadaver, he doesn't. He wants to expedite a cremation. And let me give you a little bit of background about how coroners and medical examiners look at cremations. And it does vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. However, both jurisdictions that I worked in, if we knew that there was going to be a cremation, and even if it was a natural death, we had a policy, particularly in my last office, that we would hop in our vehicle and we would drive directly to the crematory, and we would examine the body before the body ever went into the crematory. We would examine that body. We would take detailed photographs. We would strip the body down so that there's no clothing. We would want to look over every inch of the body to see if there's anything external presenting. And in addition to that, I always had a set of syringes with me. We would draw blood. We draw urine, we draw vitreous fluid out of the eyes just so that we had it. And these were even in cases where we knew that these were natural deaths. If we knew that there was going to be a cremation and it was going to be local, we would go there and examine the body. Why? Well, unlike a burial where you can have the individual extricated from the ground after they've been in the ground for a while, once you're cremated, you're cremated. That's forever and ever. Amen. There's no going back. There's no do-overs. And so when a medical examiner starts hearing someone say, I want a cremation done immediately, I want this to happen immediately, then that's going to set off all kinds of bells and whistles for them. They're going to put on a full court press. Not only are they going to do an autopsy, they're going to do probably one of the most thorough autopsies that you can possibly imagine. And when it comes to drug screens, they're going to look for everything, Dave.
And that actually became a question for Connor Bowman. Joe, you mentioned the expediting of a cremation would actually cause a more in-depth inspection. I wonder about that. Have you ever been in that situation where somebody that, in a case you were involved in, where somebody was pushing to have that cremation done fast?
Yes, I was. And I was not the investigator on that particular case. I was kind of an adjunct to it. It was one of my colleagues that had it, and it turned out to be a homicide.
Wow.
And it was a violent homicide. It was a person that had been suffocated.
Oh.
But made to look as though that it was a natural death. Person had a lot of disease processes that were going on and that sort of thing. And something happened with my colleague that triggered this in his brain. And I still think back to that day when he's telling us about the story. And of course, I went into the morgue to see the body at that time. And you could actually pick up very faintly on marks that were adjacent to the face that they looked kind of subtle. But then when you kind of retracted the eyelids and you were able to appreciate those little petechiae in there, you knew that something bad had gone on.
A couple things as we move forward here. Connor Bowman pushes for the expedited cremation, doesn't work. Now the flags are up. They call the detective, hey, I got a suspicious death. And that immediately started the tongues wagging. Again, 4 days. We're only talking 4 days from the time she shows up at the hospital with what appears to be food poisoning till she's dead. On the 5th day, her husband is demanding she get cremated in a hurry. All of a sudden, detectives are called, and then other people who know both of the Bowmans are calling detectives, and they're sharing different stories about Well, after she died, Connor Bowman made a comment to a friend. Well, at least he got a $500,000 life insurance policy. He had a whole lot of debt, and it was a source of a problem. Friends knew they were discussing divorce. Friends knew this was an overdone thing, and there was a lot of suspicion because, again, Connor Bowman, he was looking up a number of things, and it wasn't just colchicine. He was looking up how much, based on my wife's weight, and how much would I have to give her to make it lethal? What's a lethal dosage? So we've got a doctor who is trained at dealing with a poison hotline. We have a wife that he tried to get cremated in a hurry. Doctors started having a lot of things giving a lot of information to detectives, and it's transpired in the last couple of months. And when they went back to the night before she goes to the hospital and she's having drinks with her husband at home, Betty Bowman told her friend, who they were asking, what do you think made you sick? And she said there was the last drink she had the night before was mixed up in a smoothie. And she got sick after that.
And what would you do in order to mask the taste of something? When you think about that, a smoothie, the texture of it, and also the taste of it is so complex that if there was anything that might be there that would have an unpleasant taste to it, it very well could have been disguised that way. But, immediately following this, she begins to present with this gastrointestinal problems, and suddenly she begins to go downhill. And no matter what the physicians were doing at the hospital, they couldn't stem what was coming down the tracks to Betty Bowman. And of course, it wound up in her death. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.